So, welcome back. Sorry for that. So you should have reminded us that we are 3 minutes overdue already. So the blame is on you, of course. Yeah, games again. So we'll do a bit more on particular aspects of games, and some of the points we talked about most of those, but the one I want to highlight here is in particular the idea of lowered consequence, because we didn't talk about it. We talked about the voluntary nature of participation in games, ideally. Well, I don't know how realistic that is, but you know, let's assume that's the case. Lowered consequence is also a nice one, because it's like in yeah, I don't know. Assuming you are reaching a failure state, which could be described as death, right? So you're falling off a building in GTA or the like, right? So the lowered consequence is one of the important characteristics of games. Usually, you don't, suffer the equivalence of the realistic consequence that would be associated with death by falling off a building, because you can play again, right? So it's a game over thing, and it usually means, yeah, I need to do it again. It's not like final state. So that's also one aspect of games that is of course important to mention, right? So when you're talking about modeling the challenge, lose and win conditions in particular, that's also about thinking, okay, how do we make it so that it's still entertaining, right? So if you say, well, you buy the game, the first time you actually have the game over state or failure state, you're dying basically, you can't play the game anymore. That would be a realistic consequence, right? So that would be the equivalent to realism, that you actually, the game is over for good. You can't ever play it again, and even though you paid your 600 krona. So that would be one way, but of course by softening those conditions you can actually increase the entertainment value of the game and keep the player involved. So it's about balancing the feedback values in particular, but that's something that you of course needs to explore. And usually, how do you test those things? I mean, this was an extreme case. You can play the game only once and then never again. It's kind of a bit of a semi-stupid idea. Actually, it's just a stupid idea. But how do you test balancing of games? How much punishment, how much reward do you give to players? How do you test it? How do you model it? Yep. Play testing. Good, right? Play testing, right? So you actually use people. Surprise, surprise, and let them test it, right? Let them actually play it and see, what they think, and then you ask them questions afterwards, right? Playtesting is a super important aspect, and we're not talking about software development testing stuff, right? So if you write code, you need to write some test suites to test the code. That's not the point. It's really about testing the entertainment value of your game, right? So actually, does it meet the objective it set out to, achieve in the first place, right? So it's one of the important things. So some optional aspects, of course, story and narrative, so it goes in line, it's hand in hand. It's basically an overarching theme that drives you. Particular open world scenarios, they need this to some extent, right? That you set an atmosphere, right, that makes the player want to explore particular things, right? So because it's like he or she is primed to do that in the very first place. I give an example in a second. And of course the entertainment aspects. But we talked a lot about this already, so there you go, my machine is slow. That one. Cool. So games are not standing on their own right, but some aspects that need to be differentiated. We did this, I think, already, but we didn't want to really interrupt the discussion, but nevertheless here it's in a bit of a slide style fashion. Some aspects that are different, or entities that are different or similar to games, that you guys should reflect on about, right? So for example, stories, right? Are stories games? Not necessarily, but potentially.
They can be if implemented right.
Okay, so what would need to be implemented in the story? So
basically, again, like you can have a game that is basically a story, but you can't have a story alone that isn't a game. That is a game.
Or you can implement some sort of interactivity and get something like telltale games or something.
Yeah, that's right. Right, so you need to have this player effect involved, the interactivity, I guess, the characters. But you summed it up well, right? Story alone is not a game, but a game can have a story, right? So it's kind of the inverted relationship. Marius pointed to puzzles already earlier, so that's usually a very well-defined game. That's this one, there on, yeah. So a particular problem that you actually solving, right? Very well-defined goal, objective in the game, so it's not really open-ended. and very specific. There's only one right win or lose state, not multiple. Not an optimization problem where you get collect percentages to approximate the highest possible achievement in a game context, but it's actually well defined in advance. Something here which I kind of like. That's why I will highlight this. In terms of storylines in games, there's two different types in which games are actually modeled with respect to the story. In one case is, of course, that you script the entire story in the first place, right? So the player doesn't have much of a choice but to follow. That's probably more the traditional approach in gaming, that I mean, for example, a jump and run game, right? So it has basically that characteristic. There's not much flexibility in terms of the player. Yeah, he can go left and right, but realistically, the story, goes to the right side. So you basically just follow the story. In this case, the story is embedded, right? So there's not much flexibility. Whereas open world games actually allow you to some extent, not completely, but to some extent, to shape the narrative, right? So it may actually emerge at runtime, right? So that's and if you think about this, is of course gives us much more of an ingenious or a hard challenge to actually develop a game in which the story actually emerges and not pre-scripted in the first place, right? How can you ensure that whatever choices the player takes, and that's the hard bit, whenever you give the player choice, that's where it becomes tricky for you as a designer. How do you ensure that there's some overall meaningful narrative coming out of it? How do you ensure the statement's not suddenly getting stupid when you open that particular door and the player enters into a new part of the world, right? So how do you ensure this? So that's a tricky one. So the embedded nature is, of course, a lot simpler, but nowadays I think the emergent aspect is increasingly highlighted. So contrast to a toy, I think, do we share that conception? So the idea is there that that's something we actually just play with, right? So it has the play characteristic, but possibly in the interactivity. Is it a game? Toy? Can be not. Who says not a game?
I would say the toy itself is not a game.
Okay.
But I also, like, if you're gonna do it, compare it to video games, like a computer in itself is not a game. But you can use it to make or play the game.
Cool.
Like the ball is not a game, but you use it to play the game.
Yep. So you see like a toy, like a tool in a way, right? So it's a means to a particular end, right? So okay. Yeah, I intuitively share that perspective as well.
If you take like Rubik's Cube,
yeah,
it has a goal, so could it be considered a game?
That's a good one, a very good one.
It's a puzzle, so
it's a puzzle.
technically it's not a game, it's just a puzzle.
It's replayable.
But yeah,
It's replayable. Yep.
And you don't need to have the same world.
Yeah.
So you can increase the challenge level, right? So by making it increasingly confusing. That's right. So
And
I guess.
likely won't be the same every time. So
Exactly.
it has the replayable.
yeah, characteristics. So that's one of them. But the other thing is also, I think, let's put a bit of subjectivity to it, because if you give someone, let's say someone coming from Mars, a Rubik's Cube, does he or she, or it, I don't know, is that person able to play the game? Are the rules embedded in the artifact itself? I mean, if any of you gets a Rubik's Cube, you guys need to, know what you're going to do, right? Because you saw it at so many YouTube videos that people do it in one hand with the closed eyes and all that stuff, or you had to do it in school, and if it was me, I failed miserably, but you probably succeeded. Let's assume that. Then you at least know what the rules are, right? So that's kind of an implicit knowledge that you carry around with you. But the toy itself does not necessarily carry the rules, right? So again, it puts it more into the tool perspective, that is a means to an end in a way, and only in conjunction with the rules, then suddenly it becomes a playful exercise with all the characteristics of repeatability, increasing complexity, and possibly entertainment for some people, I guess. Yep. So that's kind of the differentiation. So it's always an element of the rules that are associated with the toy in order to make it some sort of game. Otherwise, it's kind of a tool, I guess. Cool. Puzzles. Puzzles is clear. The idea is here mostly that it's really clearly defined. The solution is really unambiguous. So anyone should be able to assess whether something has been completed or not. Sometimes hard in games, right? So But in puzzles, generally, you would be able to clearly assess that, and usually quite intuitively and quickly. Cool. So generally, one of the definitions used here would be to say that puzzles are basically a subset of games. All puzzles are a form of game, right? But a very well-defined game with unambiguous goals. So a tool, I'll jump over that because it's basically just kind of the toy conception we discussed here, a means to an end, but it doesn't necessarily have any other value in itself. Okay, so same toys. So one of the aspects that are of course important is that games can be increasingly very trivial or increasingly complex by offering different aspects. Of course, interaction, especially in modern games, we expect that choice on part of the player. So sometimes, well, what are examples of? Do you know any games that don't offer choice? I'm just thinking about this. Are there games that don't have choice components?
Do you mean like no choice at all?
Yep.
Or just like false choice?
No choice.
Well, what do you consider a choice? Like in Space Invaders, you can go left, right, and shoot.
Exactly.
Is that a choice?
Yeah.
Well,
No, right? So because like, so what would be an example of something where you don't have a choice? Someone.
Movie.
Sorry? What was that?
A movie.
Yes, exactly, right? Movie, right? Or some even characterize, that's an interesting one. That's when I want to bring up books. What's your position on that one?
Depends on the books, because you can have books where you can like, do you want to do this or this? Jump to this page.
Right, exactly, right? So, exactly, I agree. Usually, conventionally, the idea is that books don't have that flexibility either, but you're right. In practice, they actually do. Or often or increasingly have some sort of choice element in there. So, yeah, so that's one of the things. Feedback, of course, objective. So feedback, the key thing about feedback is it needs to be really balanced. That's the hard part, by actually not creating just a game in a narrative, if you like, but actually also figuring out that the game makes sense and is somewhat balanced and playable by individuals. Objectives and rules well balanced. One of the recent games that came out, and we're talking tech here, it's Red Dead Redemption. Did anyone play the previous iteration edition of that one? Yep. So what's your impression? What's particular about this game?
It's an open world game.
Yep.
Or sandbox game, as some people call it. There's a lot of depth to it and a lot of small things that you can do around the world. So you have, especially in the new one, you have the main quests, which are just the main story. Then you have side missions, which only appear during certain parts of the main story.
Mm-hmm.
So if you continue on with the main story and don't do the side quests, they will disappear. And then there's other activities that you don't have to do through the quests of hunting, or just talking to people, or just messing about really.
Mm-hmm. So what makes it so different from other open world games?
There's always something to do, I think. Because a lot of other open world games, like Just Cause, for example, to me at least, it feels very empty once you're done with the main story, because there's no more enemies and there's nothing to do really other than just run around. So it stops being a game in a way. But I feel like a lot of Rockstar games in general, they're still fun to play once you're done with the story.
So it's currently pretty hyped, this game, right? So I don't know if you have followed the news on this one, but it seems to define the new type of open world games, particularly because of those characteristics. Because you can shape your story after after the game is over. You don't necessarily need to have even if you're a completion rate of 100%, you can still continue and do hunting, fishing, or shooting enemies. But there's also an element of realism in there built in, for example, right? So that approximates reality in a bit more different sense. What kind of game is it actually? We didn't talk about this. I just asked you, okay, what do you think about this game? What is, what's the theme? What's the narrative?
It's an open world Western action game.
Yeah. So it's a kind of Western theme, right? So you basically engage in there, and you're thrown into pretty nasty situations there. You actually need to, solve and free people and all that kind of stuff. So you basically have the kind of cowboy mentality of roaming around the landscape, empty landscape, and then entering cities and being suddenly in a pretty questionable situations. But one of the please.
Something I feel about this game is that like I feel like the world is alive, even though I'm not interacting specifically with one person. I feel like the lives go on. Like not many games can do that. It's just like I feel like it's really alive while I'm not doing anything, and then I like see that they kind of progressed while I didn't do anything, but they just did it. So, yeah.
Right. So that's a very good point. You have like a notion of parallel lifelines, right? So where your lifeline continues, but the other protagonists, the NPCs, non-player characters, So terminology again for the ones that are interested. So they continue as well, right? So whether you do something or not, you just continue fishing, and suddenly the change or the state of the world has changed, even though you have not interacted with it. Very good point. Very good point. But one of the other aspects I just want to highlight is also the game is pretty acclaimed. I feel like I'm doing advertising here, but I think it's a good example because it has exactly those characteristics in there. Is the realism, and the particular aspect is one example that was mentioned. If you, for example, run towards a sheriff at pace towards the sheriff too fast and so on, he will actually start shooting at you. Because it's of course considered a threat, right? Think about the modern day narrative about American policemen, right? If you walk around with something bulky in your pocket, you most likely be subjective to some sort of, suspected of some potential gun violence and so on. Similar here, right? So, but it's actually built into the game. It's not just you run towards a random character who happens to look like a sheriff, right? Because that's the game how it's modeled. But it actually really embraces the roles of the individuals and their thinking, right? So it takes the roles in particular into account. So this is really where different aspects come to play, both in terms of the boundaries, the objectives of the games, but also realism, which is not really listed here. But it boils down to the lowered consequences in a way, because it's a very good example that you actually have close to realistic consequences for behavior you would do in the real world, right? It approximates reality quite well. So. And I think we get increasingly there. So something to keep an eye on. So it's often those secondary characteristics nowadays that make gameplay more exciting. Not so much the main storyline, which everyone does and everyone is reasonably good at, but actually to fill up the space, right? So that we have a true open world experience, right? So yes. So yeah, true open world experience. Just like me this morning going out and realizing, oh shit. So that was the open world experience. So. Good. Okay. So rules. Yeah, I think we need to, of course, share a understanding of rules. What are rules? Rules kind of define what you can do in a wider sense, right? So, and they define what's possible in the first place. Those would be usually physical laws, right? So, what's possible, what's not. Can I walk through walls? In the real world, I can't. In your game, you sometimes can. That's usually the first mistake that people do when they start game development and forget. Damn. Need to beat collision. Anyway, so let's not go into this. And so it's an important part, of course, the rules, right? The boundaries of what you can do, not only of the gameplay, but also physical world that needs to be defined. And the easiest way, of course, is to deal with hard boundaries, right? Open world games are, again, a nasty example because you need to accommodate the fact that you can do kind of everything, or you can't necessarily even anticipate the interactions of the player with the environment. We don't even know what the player, you should know what the player can possibly do, but you can't anticipate what the player will do in a particular situation. Yeah. But if you, for example, model a soccer game a la FIFA 2018 or whatever the versions nowadays, who knows, you kind of work with hard boundaries, right? So you just delimit a playing field, and then you don't need to worry about the physical laws out of sight of that playing field, but can just carefully model all possible interaction within this area. Makes things a lot simpler, right? So if you want to have a game in which you can guarantee that you keep the challenge level right, that you don't have undefined states like win or lose conditions. So sometimes you may imagine that imagine you have a soccer game, you walk out of the gate and nothing happens, and you're suddenly outside on the road. So it's kind of if there's no interactivity model, for example, buying stuff or selling stuff or interacting with other players, then you suddenly lose the ability to model any challenge, right? So, but one way of dealing with this is simply to have a hard boundary. In sports games, that's quite common, of course, to do that this way. So rules are important. I get back to that, to rules and the differentiation to capabilities in a second. This is Björn. Björn will help us in a second, but I'm still not quite done. So we'll come back to you in a second. So yeah, feedback of course is relevant, right? So it needs to be well modeled, and it can be in different forms and ways, right? Of course, you can have metrics such as percentage of completion. You can have sound, visuals, emotional responses of your player characters, right? That they're similarly smile or something like this. You know that. What was this nasty animal that you carried around your pocket? That was very in the early 2000s.
Tamagotchi?
Yeah, Tamagotchi, that's one, right? So that thing was smiling or crying or whatever else, but that's roughly it, right? So the feedback was limited to very simple mechanisms, right? But of course, in a wider sense, it can also just be in a community sense, having forum status, right? Being a newbie, you know, rookie, and then the intermediate, advanced, getting more status. That's also a form of feedback that is built into the social arena, right? Which complements the game itself. It's not part of the game itself, but part of it. So before we get to something more interesting, the last thing I want to just point out to game is of course about interactivity. And there's two aspects of interactivity. One of them is capability, and the other one is affordances. Does anyone know the difference between those two ones? Capability, it's not written there, I think. No, it's not. Lucky me. Capability and affordances. What's capability? Let's try that one. Please, sorry.
Well, if you're capable, you're able to do something.
So it's a delineation of your abilities, right? So what you can do possibly, right? So all the stuff you can physically do, including mental or skills aspect and so on. That's right. Cool. Affordances. Yeah, but you're nearly there because it's the complement of it. Well, it's basically what the environment lets you do. Yeah, so you can do a lot of things possibly, you know, touch things, move things, and so on. But if the environment doesn't allow you to open the windows, right, that's an affordance that you know, either can or cannot, you know, use independent of your capability. So one of the things about modeling a game comprehensive is also thinking about both aspects. Not only what can the player do, but also what do you allow the player to do. Basically, what the environment allows the player to do. Right. So those two aspects need to be balanced as well. There's limited value of giving a player a large set of capabilities, such as, for example, pulling a gun or whatever else, but not allowing him to actually shoot somebody based on the environmental properties. Right. So it would be really not an exciting gameplay you have there. So you need to balance both worlds. The problem is there. If we think about stories, if we think about our real-world interaction, we don't think about affordances because we know exactly what we can do in the environment. We treat it as intuitive. We know how to interact with doors, right? We don't need to have we know how to interact with Ruby cubes as well, right? So we don't need to discuss that explicitly. When you design a game, you need to. You need to be very clear about what's possible and what's not, right? The affordances. So they're usually not.
Is Rubik cube a game?
No, it comes. Okay. Right. Well, we had this already. So,
Okay.
but you can, you know.
It's that puzzle.
Okay.
But then if you're doing it on time and participating in competitions, then it becomes a game.
Just cut the stuff. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So competition. We get there. So yeah, cool. So yeah. So the one aspect is meaning, semantics. So you know, need to give the game a meaning. That's the objective. You do that usually by having some sort of feedback. The interface needs to be appealing. Again, the game are advertising you heavily on the first on top. But on the other hand, it's also about giving the player power and the ability to manipulate something, right? So if you can't change something in the environment, the game is boring. Generally, the idea. We need to balance rules of consequences. Game testing. We talked about this, but there's also the aspect about entertainment versus accuracy. What does that mean? Perhaps. Yep.
If a game is 100% realistic, it becomes boring.
Very nice. Yes. So that's exactly what's meant there. If you have a simulation, for example, does anyone know this one here? Not that one. Yes, but it's Rigs of Rods.
Oh, I've heard of it.
So that's the older one, but you're right. BMG is the same thing. It's basically a soft body physics simulator. So it looks like a game. You can model cars, physical vehicles, planes, arbitrary things, and you can have crashes, and you know. But it looks very realistic. I mean, it's way more realistic than things like GTA or the like in terms of deformation of the car. But there's no predefined gameplay in there, no narrative, right? So you just drive around, do stuff. So it's really more like a physics simulator. And let's just say you want to use the term boring, that's one way, right? You can make a game out of it, but usually realism is in conflict with entertainment to some extent in games, right? You need to soften the physical laws in the world. For example, if you fall in GTA, it's a different physics, physical behavior than you would expect in the real world, just to make it more entertaining, but also give you an opportunity to interact. If your fall is too fast, then you know all the affordances that the environment offer don't really help you if you can't react fast enough, right? So it's a trade-off between accuracy and entertainment here, of course, as well. Cool. Are you guys doing cutting?
Yeah, but we almost ready.
Okay. So the last thing I want to briefly talk about that we often hear about in games is genre. What's a genre? I don't know. I need to ask you. What's a genre? The same 5 people as usual, please.
Genre is, something that's described like what it's gonna show you, or kind of what it's gonna make you feel. Like a comedy will make you laugh, a romantic will make you go ah.
You think you
Like it's supposed to describe what you're supposed to know. What you should know, you will feel out after this has happened, and kind of a general without reading a synopsis what you will get.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, I know what you mean. So, so you describe. So it's kind of a. Yeah, please. Yeah, you guys should develop it, not me. Yep.
Category of gameplay time.
Yep. So that's the objective way. Category gameplay time. Well done. Right. So what's your perspective?
Just like groupings of things that are similar.
Cool. Yep. So I like you invoked the sorry. Yep, please.
Well, it's like classifying things based on their common points.
Yeah. Commonalities. So that's very good. Very good aspect there. Yeah, exactly. Right. So you were implicitly alluding to movies in particular, right? So where we have
mostly, but you can kind of same with everything. If you have a romance game, you will most likely have something with romance, and then you can have a comedy game, but it's not the same kind as a movie.
Yeah.
Mostly in movies is either action or horror or puzzle.
Yeah, that's right. So usually the movie classification is very intuitive because we're very familiar with this, right? So it usually is a scripted narrative. If you have a drama, you know what's usually happening there, right? So there's kind of good person, bad person, and then they fall in love, have some conflict, and then there's some miraculous recovery from that conflict. Please, yep.
Yeah, I was about to say that it has a lot to do with expectations for the consumer, so that they know what they are buying.
Yeah. Yes. So first thing you do, right? Saturday evening, don't have anything to do anymore. You want to watch a movie. What do you do first? Well, you're browsing by genre, right? Because you need to have this action movie to actually wind down, right? Before the next week begins, you need to teach experience design, right? So that's right. So
You need to see some blood.
so you need to see some blood, so you don't see it in class, right? That's right. So but it's exactly right. So it helps us categorize, but also possibly select. Movies that would, or in this case, movies that would interest us, but also for games, of course. I share that one. So, yeah. But commonly it's expressed as this, right? It's a category of artistic expression or composition marked by a distinctive style, form, or content. Cool. Genres in games. Please.
You mean like really
Yep.
technology specific, or kind of feeling of the game?
To think about, let's do computer games, I guess, because it's somewhat accessible. Because else gets too wide, right?
Not that way, but you have multiplayer.
So which one you
kind
find more useful?
genre.
Go for it. That's exactly what.
Like horror, puzzle, action. Open world is kind of more mechanical.
Perfect.
So
what? Yeah, all of that, right? So how do you structure it?
Huh?
Which one of the features is the most important one? If you think about categories, you look at the most salient category, right? So you came up with a chess field of possible options right now, right? So, but what do you think is the most sensible structure? Categories, as you guys mentioned it.
Like first-person shooting or mobile game.
First-person shooting, mobile game.
Mobile, like Dota and League of Legends.
Right. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Like
Yep.
First-person shooting, and like soccer, but I don't know.
Soccer,
Like football.
football. Okay. Okay. So basketball is also in a soccer category or not? No, it's a different category.
Ball games.
That's ball games, right? So it's a bit higher level.
Games.
Sports games. Oh, sorry. That didn't, I got it. Sports games. How could I know? Sorry, I don't do sports games. Anyway,
Well, I don't.
so that's good. So you have sports games, ball games and whatever else you could do, right? So, but you actually made one important point there. And that was that it's actually categorization in games is incredibly hard nowadays, right? So it's no longer, as it possibly used to be, really clear cut. You have a role-playing game, Diablo style or something like this, or racing game or first-person shooter like the Doom and all those Duke Nukem games and so on. There was in the 90s or in 80s and so on. But it actually becomes very mixed and confusing, right? So how do you characterize, for example, GTA, right? Is it an open world game? Is it a car racing game? Is it, third-person shooter game? Yes to all of them, I guess, right? So, or no to all, I don't know. So, point is, in games, it's often very hard to find a unique or clear-cut specification. And I think that's what you kind of expressed there implicitly, that it's really not as well developed. I think one of the good pointers here is like reference to Grip Shift, platform puzzle action arcade driving game. That's cool, right? That's a very good summary. So basically you have all different components in there, right? So you have platformer, you have puzzling, you have action, you have driving, you have an arcade approach to it, and still considered a game. The question is, how helpful is such categorization, such a genre? Yeah. Average, right? It's more like a tech cloud, I guess, right? So if you think about this, I don't know. So that's one of the different challenges there. There's a link to a video that discusses the challenges and also possible avenues of thinking about genres in the context of games, which is linked here. Of course, the slides will be on. You guys use Blackboard, GitLab, or how do you distribute your live stuff? What, using Blackboard?
Yeah, Blackboard.
Cool. Okay, then we use Blackboard as well. We often don't use Blackboard.
No, we don't use Blackboard.
We don't. Now we will use Blackboard. Okay, I'll put a link there somewhere to the slide set. So you can explore that in a bit more. But the idea is probably more that genres can be described by other characteristics such as content, form, and style that a game makes up. We will not have the time, which we will not take the time necessarily to go into depth in this one. But one of the things that why it still matters to have some sort of genres is that we need to find some categorization if we want to talk about games. It's similar about terminology, why we define stuff. We also need to be kind of sure, okay, if we are working in a game company and we're doing those kind of games, we need to be able to delineate as to what we're doing. Are we doing driving games, arcade games, action games, or first-person shooters and the like. So, and usually it's more sensible differentiation is by style, form, and content. What happens in practice is more that, well, it's more like a bottom-up characterization that you actually pick a game, like again, my most cited example, Red Dead Redemption here, is that this is kind of a stereotypical game from which we can expect that in the future will be copies and clones, right? Many other open world games will take elements of this one, and then suddenly this starts forming a new cluster, perhaps an own genre in its own right, that is a realistic a realistic open world game with high interactivity or whatever you want to use to describe those kind of games. So the idea is more thinking about bottom up, and someone of you said that the characterization of a genre basically happens based on similar features. I forgot who, somewhere here, someone said it. And that's a very accurate characterization, because that's basically what it more accurately is. You look at games by patterns, shared patterns. Not so much whether they fall into categories ex ante, but rather bottom up. You look at games and see, oh, they are similar, and then you form a pattern around this. And that seems to be a bit more healthy in terms of looking at the dynamics of the space. Unlike films or movies, the game space is much more dynamic in terms of new technologies and new avenues of thinking. And especially because we need to deal with the aspect of interactivity. Different input devices afford different mechanisms. They think VR games, AR games, serious games. It becomes so diverse. Realism may be more prevalent. Interactivity is more prevalent. Learning may be more or less relevant. But if you combine all of this, which is of course very much possible. You could write have a driving simulator that includes puzzles. It probably wouldn't fall into a classical racing game category anymore. So that's one of the things that we want you to keep an eye on, that you don't think in fixed and firm categories, but rather think about patterns that you detect. And probably you detect patterns that others haven't really seen yet amongst different games that you have found. There's a mini task here, but we're not going into this one right now. Instead, I will divert the attention to something else. So that's something you could possibly try out. Perhaps you have time to do it next session. But basically, thinking about games, favorite games, and characterizing them by those different characteristics that we talked about, like form, content, and style, and see if you can come up with better genres. But what we want to do now, we're nearly running out of time. We are running out. We are finishing at 10. We're finishing at 10:15. So we're changing
stand
again.
up and form 2 rows.
We're doing something else.
Yeah, you too.
I'm taking a video. I didn't introduce Björn. Björn will, there. So Björn is.
The idea is that you have a partner in front.
Yeah, I'm showing introduce Björn first, so we know who he is. Do you want to? Yeah.
Okay, come.
Me, Björn, come on. So Björn will moderate the game because he knows the game. He has been TA for this paper for N years.
He's been here forever.
He's been here forever and he will be here forever. So, but he knows.
I'm getting stuck. Yeah. That's a problem. So the basic idea is that there's going to be an exercise in looking at how slightly changing the rules messes up everything you know about game balance. So rock, paper, scissors. Hands up if you do not know rock, paper, scissors.
That's interesting.
So I had a false positive. In rock, paper, scissors, this is a perfectly balanced game. You have you have 3 options, etc., etc., etc. So if you play this,
there have been research suggesting it's not perfectly balanced game because people tend to have slight preferences. But carry on.
for all if we remove the human component,
yes. Wow.
The player component. Perfectly balanced game. You have 3 options and you select one of them. So if you play this and you're trying to get to 5 points first, it's slightly random who wins. So what if
we try to that first?
Yeah. So let's do that first. First to 3, and you can see how this feels and how you think about the game.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Ready? Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1,
That most people are done, so let's get on with it, since we don't have that much time. Yeah. We're still going to best of 3, but this time, if you win by throwing rock, you get 2 points. So you win by scissors, 1 point. You win by paper, 1 point. You win by throwing rock, you get 2 points. How does this mess up the balance? All right, now you try.
Okay, so if you throw rock and win, you get 2 points.
This is all right, ready. All right. Rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors. Okay. Rock, paper, scissors. Yes, 3-0,
6-0. All right. So the question now is that did adding 1 extra point for rock change the way you thought about what you would select first. Because I saw someone over here who instinctively was like, I'm going to throw scissors because my opponent is most likely going to throw papers because he thinks that I'm going to throw rock. And his opponent threw rock and just destroyed him. But this is, one of the things you can think about is how does this affect the way you think about it? Question?
There's a question?
Question?
No questions?
We're discussing comments?
All right.
So what's your finding?
Huh?
I'm pretty sure you picked rock on the first.
No.
Yeah, okay.
I picked scissors.
No, you picked rock.
No, I
we don't have time to discuss temporal matters. So another way that this has been experimented with has been through the rock paper scissors RPG, and this is based on the same system that you will get more points based on what you throw, except that you choose what you get more points on. So we have some stickers. They are rock, paper, scissors. We have the rock clan, the scissor clan, and the pepper clan. It's basically the slightly sneaky and accurate, the full-on might, and the wise. The idea is that you can pick one clan, which will give you, or two clans, due to time constraints, two clans, which will give you extra points for throwing that. You can choose. You can choose two of the same if you want to, and then you're going to play to best of 5 and see what happens and see how this changes the dynamic of the game. So the stickers are up here. If you can come and pick some.
So pick 2 clans. They can be the same, they can be different.
The clans that you pick will decide which phase you get more points on. I'm not going to put that on my Mario. That wasn't me who made it. I blame suboptimal engineering.
You have to play with the stickers to make them into stickers, actually. So you have to use the back side to form the sticky surface, and then you have kind of a sticker. Perfect.
So the idea now is that what you've chosen is what gives you extra points. So I usually go for the all-out in one side strategy. You tend to be all paper because all academics. So now you have to get your opponent to see which papers or which powers you have, and vice versa. And then you play to best of 5. If you win by any of the clans that you have, you get extra points. So if you have 2 rock, you get 3 points by winning with rock. If you have 1 rock and 1 scissor, you would get 2 points by winning with rock and 2 points by winning with scissor. Did everybody understand this?
No.
Did the ones who were trying to teach it to understand this? Good.
And you play by elimination, so if you lose, you sit down, and the rest continues to play.
Yes.
That's probably
So, you ready? And paper. Jesus, we the same. Okay, let's go. 1, 2, 3. Good. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Yeah. So you want? Okay, you carry on.
I go back my side doing this. Get it back. And I beat everybody 5-0. I know you're going to throw this, so I won. And then for that split second, and then you throw the thing that defeats all players. I was like, I know, that's the thing.
4 points.
In the assignment, you used and also we had an odd number of players.
Out of 5. Who gets to 5 first wins?
I'm so sorry to say this line.
He won by throwing 5 scissors, taking out 5 papers.
Who's still place? Okay, the finals. Woohoo!
Alright, so just say.
Two last ones.
So, was it more fun after the rules were modified? What do you think?
It's extremely unfair.
Hey! Hey!
Okay.
Just say the council in the cause or the rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors. That's correct. Rock, paper, scissors. Are you Korean? Rock, paper, scissors. I didn't know.
Well done.
Good games.
Good games.
Yeah, whatever that meant. So I think that's it for now, because we're well over time, I understand? Right, so, but you probably got the gist, well, some of you, I didn't, but some of you got the gist of what difference it makes to actually change the rules of the game, right? So it runs, well, particularly with prior knowledge about the weights and so on. Please.
I have a last question. On Thursday, are you going to have this repeated or are you going to have continuing?
Oh, for crying out loud, we forgot that the class is split. And we didn't inform them that the class is not split anymore.
We have a video now.
Thursday. So yeah, so people who didn't show up will watch the video. And on Thursday we do new thing.
Okay.
Oh, really? Is it split here?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have a video.
Yes.
Okay, we need to think about
we think about it and we announce it on Blackboard.
So,
yeah.
Thank you.